Do adherents of Shinto believe in angels?
Perhaps the closest formal analogy to the angel in Shinto tradition are the tennin. The Japanese version of Buddhism, celestial nymphs called apsaras. They are spirits, but other than that, they do not function quite the way angels do in other traditions. Lovely celestial beings have sometimes been said to descend and dance in response to divinely beautiful music. If we focus on the functional parallels on angels as messengers of the divine world, Shinto offers a number of analogies. But they don't look at all like angels. These messengers are, for example, Inari's fox and the monkey assistant of Suno, the mountain king. Another functional aspect of angels is that of protection and generally mediating peace and blessing. Shinto psychology divides soul or spirit into two main types: positive and negative. Nijamitama are the benign spirits that either bestow blessing on or effect spiritual changes in people or natural objects. In that sense, they function somewhat like angelic spirits. But they were not necessarily created as spirits as angels are. They can be the spirits of the deceased that continue to roam the cosmos. A post-war sect called Byakko Shinkokai, however, focused on a modified version of the guardian angel as an essential spiritual power.
What is the Analects of Confucius?
Excerpts from Book 2 of the Analects. 1. The Master said, "He who exercises government by means of his virtue may be compared to the North Polar Star, which keeps its place and all the stars turn towards it." The Master said, "If the people be led by the laws, and uniformity sought to be given them by punishments, they will try to avoid the punishment, but they have no sense of shame. If they be led by virtue, and uniformity sought to be given them by the rules of propriety, they will have the sense of shame, and moreover will become good." The Master said, "At 15, I had my mind bent on learning. At 30, I stood firm. At 40, I had no doubts. At 50, I knew the decrees of heaven. At 60, my ear was an obedient organ for the reception of truth. At 70, I could follow what my heart desired, without transgressing what was right." Mang Idza asked what filial piety was. The Master said, "It is not being disobedient." Soon after, as Fan Chih was driving him, the Master told him, saying, "Mang I asked me what filial piety was, and I answered him, not being disobedient." Fan Chih said, "What did you mean?" The Master replied, that parents, when alive, should be served according to propriety, that, when dead, they should be buried according to propriety, and that they should be sacrificed to according to propriety. 10. The Master said, "See what a man does. Mark his motives. Examine in what things he rests.
Have there been any major ascetics in the history of Christian spirituality?
Asceticism is an intensely focused spiritual striving that emphasizes various forms of self-discipline. According to the New Testament, Jesus himself led a simple life and taught his followers that it was preferable to possess only the basic necessities. He counseled followers to deny themselves luxuries if they wished to follow him. Jesus did not recommend extreme forms of self-denial as such. Nevertheless, individuals and small groups throughout Christian history often have interpreted the gospel preference for simplicity and non-attachment in dramatic ways. Some Christians have engaged in strict fasts, arduous penances, and occasionally even self-mutilation. Several early Christians sat atop pillars. Some had tiny huts, some would like tree houses, for lengthy periods. These Stylites took their cue from Assyrian, Simeon, c. 390 to 459, to whose pillar many pilgrims came to pray and to send up a few supplies. Pillar ascetics were not uncommon in the Middle East for about 500 years. The ideals of the Desert Fathers, who began the monastic movement and called their followers to a life of voluntary poverty and solitude, are still emphasized by such strict religious orders as the Trappists.
What will I see if I visit a Buddhist temple?
A lot depends on where you are and the size of the temple. Local or neighborhood temples are generally of simpler design than those that function like cathedral temples or are closely associated with the main institution of a monastic community. Larger foundations throughout Asia are often visible from a distance, punctuating the skyline with their stupa spires or lofty pagodas. Walled enclosures entered through monumental gateways surround the more important foundations. Before entering any temple, however grand or humble, you will see a rack in which to deposit your footwear. Interior appointments vary somewhat according to culture and denomination. Most traditional temples are divided into two main areas. The congregational space usually has no furniture. When worshippers pause for meditation or recitation, they ordinarily either stand or sit on the floor. Some temples have individual meditation pillows stacked along the walls. But some Buddhist temples in Europe and the United States have adopted the Protestant Christian use of pews or benches without kneelers. Many such temples actually belong to denominations that call themselves churches. Look at the back of a bench and you are likely to find hymn books in a rack. Many temples separate the sanctuary area from the body of the building with a railing or columns. A large image of the Buddha or a major bodhisattva stands or sits atop an altar, sometimes in the company of several smaller images. Before the altar is a place for the priest or prayer leader to sit. Side altars dedicated to bodhisattvas or holy persons, such as founders of the various lineages, are not uncommon. Some temples have meditative gardens adjacent to the formal worship space.
What is sectarian Shinto?
Thirteen principal sects comprise what is generally referred to as sectarian or sect, Kyoha, Shinto. Arising over the centuries and officially recognized in the early 20th century. The 13 cluster around 5 themes or emphases. First, 2 groups that emphasize purification are known as Misaji-kyo and Shinshu-kyo. Kyo means teaching or school. Fuzu-kyo, Jiko-kyo, and Ontake-kyo are called mountain sects because they centered around cults of 2 sacred mountains, Fuji and Ontake. They restructured along distinctively Shinto lines the teachings of several earlier ascetically oriented groups called Shugendo. 3 more recent sects have focused on faith healing. Kurozumai-kyo, Tenri-kyo, and Kanko-kyo all trace their origins to a founding figure. 2 sects called Shinto Shoseiha and Shinto Taisei-kyo have emphasized Confucian elements and have blended features of the purification and mountain sects as well. Finally, among the 13 are the most recent groups, whose mission has been to renew Shinto tradition. These are Izumo Oyashiro-kyo, Shinri-kyo, and Shinto Tai-kyo. The latter is an umbrella organization that was largely responsible for the official recognition of the 13. From these sects, dozens of smaller movements have arisen in recent times.
Do Daoists pray in any particular language?
Since Daoism originated in China, one would naturally expect that most practitioners of the tradition pray in Chinese. That is so not because of any essential identification of Chinese as a sacred language or liturgical tongue as such. Use of the vernacular has been the general practice in Daoism. And until recently it happens that most practitioners have been Chinese speakers. So as small pockets of Daoist practice have arisen here and there outside China, especially in recent times, practitioners have used their native tongues in ritual.
How does this system of religious law work?
Some legal specialists rise to greater prominence because of their erudition, earning the title mujtahid. Pronounced mujtahid, one who exercises independent investigation of the sacred sources. In Sunni tradition, the door of independent investigation closed by the year 900. Making further bold scholarship of this level unnecessary. According to that classical view, the founders of the 4 major Sunni schools of legal theory were the last mujtahids. But in Shi'i tradition, the highest-ranking ayatollahs continue to exercise the authority of mujtahids. In both traditions, it is up to scholars to offer rulings on controversial or contemporary issues. If a new ethical and legal question arises, a question of artificial life support or some other thorny biomedical matter. For example, a legal scholar would search the relevant sources to determine whether the Quran or Hadith might shed light on the precise issue at hand. If the scholar found only vague parallels that offer insufficient evidence to make a firm ruling on the new problem, he would then study further to see whether in the actual practice of Muslim communities there was an approach that might solve the problem. If the problem is too new to have any kind of useful history, the scholar might appeal to reasoning by analogy, looking for a link between ancient sources and practice and the new problem. Ancient sources may say nothing about artificial life support, but they have much to say about the nature of human life and about human authority to intervene. On the basis of his research, the scholar might then issue a legal advisory called a fatwa. In that statement he would indicate to which of 5 ethico-legal categories the proposed course of action, say, disconnecting life support in a particular case, belonged, forbidden, discouraged, neutral, recommended, or required. Acting upon the advisory, the parties to the case might then choose to bring the matter before a religious judge called a qadi, pronounced Kaadi, himself authorized as a mufti, to adjudicate the matter. The outcome of all this study and interpretation is called Sharia, pronounced Shari'ah. The divinely revealed law or way of life prescribed for all Muslims.
Why, after Jesus Christ? Is Saint Paul considered the most influential teacher in the history of Christianity?
Paul, whose original name was Saul or Shaul, was born in the town of Tarsus, Cilicia, in modern southeastern Turkey, of Jewish parents of the tribe of Benjamin. Both his parents were Roman citizens. It is safe to assume that Paul's earliest language was Koine Greek, the household language of all educated Roman citizens throughout the empire. Paul was sent at an early age to Jerusalem to attend Bible school, studying with a famous rabbi, Gamaliel. He learned to write in both Greek and Hebrew and became thoroughly versed in the law. It seems certain that Paul studied in Jerusalem during the 3 years of Jesus' public life and that he was present at the time that the Romans crucified Jesus. Paul may even have heard Jesus preach. He certainly must have heard of Jesus and his movement among the people. Apparently, Paul had gained an outstanding reputation as a young rabbinic student because he was authorized to seek out and prosecute members of a new sect who proclaimed that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah. Paul apparently made several trips throughout Palestine in search of Christians. On one such trip from Jerusalem to Damascus, about the year 34 CE, Paul underwent a conversion. 4 accounts of Paul's conversion exist: Acts 9:3-19, 22:6-21, 26:12-18, and Galatians 1:12-16.
What are the Dead Sea Scrolls?
In the spring of 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd, Muhammad Adh, discovered 11 ancient leather scrolls in a cave located in the cliffs above the northeastern corner of the Dead Sea. The 11 so-called Dead Sea Scrolls comprise 7 distinct manuscripts. Through the work of E. L. Skinnick and other authorities, the 11 scrolls have been authenticated as genuine documents of roughly the 2nd century BCE to the time of the unsuccessful Jewish revolt against Rome, CE 66–70. The manuscripts were written variously in Hebrew and Aramaic. They include portions of several of the books of the Old Testament, Apocrypha, prayers, hymns, commentaries, and rules. The most important set is the Manual of Discipline. Between 1949 and 1956, archaeological exploration of the area west of the Dead Sea was carried out by G. Lancaster Harding and Father Roland de Vaux. The two men explored the original cave and more than 200 others, finding numerous additional fragments of scrolls and other evidence of human occupancy. Most of these caves are located in the vicinity of Khirbet, Arabic for ruin, Qumran itself less than a mile south of the original cave, and in the ravine of Wadi Murabat some 10 miles farther south. The manuscripts discovered at Wadi Murabat are very important in that, unlike those at Khirbet Qumran, they indicate that the Hebrew Bible had reached its final form by about 140 CE. The older Khirbet Qumran biblical manuscripts reveal a scriptural text that was still evolving. The discoveries of the Dead Sea Scrolls stand among the greatest finds in the history of modern archaeology. The scrolls shed much light on the religious and political life of the Jewish people in the centuries just before and after the time of Christ. In addition, the documents are of great importance for the understanding of early Christianity. The biblical scrolls antedate the earliest extant Hebrew text by about 1,000 years. Fragments of the Isaiah text discovered at Wadi Murabat are in complete agreement with the current biblical text, thus confirming the authenticity of later Hebrew texts.
Who are Shi'i Muslims?
Various Shi'i communities have been identifiable since at least the 8th century. Among the principal features that distinguish Shi'i from Sunni tradition is the belief that a legitimate successor to leadership, called imam, pronounced imam, must be designated by his predecessor and belong to the family of the Prophet. According to ancient Shi'i belief, Muhammad did designate his cousin Ali, but Abu Bakr, Umar and Uthman managed to usurp power and prevent Ali from assuming his rightful place. Around the middle of the 8th century a split developed over who would be the 7th Imam. One group continued to pledge their loyalty to a man named Ismail, who had just died. Even though Ismail's father, the 7th Imam Ja'far, appointed a replacement when Ismail died. The faction that stayed with Ismail came to be called the Ismailis. or seveners, since their line of imams ended then. There are now at least two major branches of seveners, one of which looks to the Aga Khan as its spiritual leader. The larger group of Shiites in the 8th century believed the legitimate line of imams extended to a 12th, and ended when that imam went into concealment until his expected return at the end of time. 12er Shiites are by far the majority community, constituting nearly all of Iran's and more than half of Iraq's people.
How is the devil significant for Christians?
The English word devil comes from the Greek diabolos, meaning one who throws something against, in short, a disruptive power or presence. In the Gospels, Jesus deals with many such presences. Sometimes the presence is associated with a physical disease, sometimes with what seems to be a form of psychosis. There is a subtle distinction between a devil and an evil spirit, the latter being a soul gone awry under the influence of the former. According to tradition, the only difference between an angel and a devil is that a devil has made a choice that caused the loss of divine grace. Lucifer, bearer of light, is the name of the angel who first separated himself definitively from God and got the name Satan or adversary. Others are said to have followed his example and joined an army of malevolence under Satan's lead. In one of the few remaining mythological elements in Christian tradition, Satan does battle against the forces of good represented by the Holy Spirit. At the end of time, Satan and his minions will suffer crushing defeat. Homage to the devil remains a feature of folk traditions among Christians in many parts of the world. In a mountainside cave in Guatemala overlooking Lake Atitlan, for example, locals still show interested visitors the remnants of chickens sacrificed to the Prince of the World, represented oddly by a stone cross on the wall. This is not the same as Satanism or devil worship as such, but an acknowledgement of the continuing presence of evil in the world. Popular lore has cloaked the devil in red, given him horns, a pointed tail, and a pitchfork, but imagery of that sort does not have biblical roots.
What is distinctive about Orthodox Judaism?
Emphasis on the direct, verbatim revelation of the Torah to Moses is the foundation of Orthodox Jewish tradition. Rabbinical interpretation of Torah serves the purpose of drawing out the meanings of Scripture so that every situation in life is anchored in divine revelation. If Scripture does not address an issue directly, the rabbi employs traditional principles of exegesis to make what limited adaptations are deemed necessary. Strict observance of the 613 commands and prohibitions contained in the Torah is perhaps the most significant feature of orthodoxy. As an increasingly distinctive approach, Orthodoxy began to emerge in 18th century Europe. In response to the perception that Jews were being assimilated too rapidly into society at large, reform attempts to adapt ritual observance in early 19th century Europe elicited a strong reaction on the part of those who refused to acknowledge a need for more than the most minimal adaptation. Orthodox Jews consider their communities a last bastion of tradition in an increasingly secularized world. Just over 1 American Jew out of 10 belongs to an Orthodox synagogue.
What are the major festivities historically associated with CIT?
Each year on the day before the winter solstice, the emperor and his retinue visited the Temple of Heaven for an elaborate event. When paying homage to heaven and earth, the emperor would perform special gestures of humility by kneeling 3 times and prostrating himself 9 times. When he sacrificed to other powers, such as the sun, the moon, and the gods with power over the forces of nature, the emperor did not perform those rituals of self-abasement. At the Forbidden City's Hall of Supreme Harmony, major sacred events included the enthronement of a new emperor, royal weddings, an event held every 10 years called the Great Anniversary, announcement of results of civil service examinations, and celebrations of the winter solstice and New Year. In the Hall of Middle Harmony, the emperor formulated decrees to be made public in royal temples at all the various seasonal festivities. Imperial officials designated by the emperor, or local administrators in the case of smaller events, took care of the regular agriculturally significant occasions throughout the country.
Do Shinto practitioners revere any persons as especially gifted with wisdom?
Japanese tradition generally has held teachers in high regard. But, in the words of one famous Japanese scholar, Shinto is caught rather than taught. As a result, sages, scholars, and teachers do not occupy the place of honor in Shinto tradition to which, for example, Confucianism has elevated them. Human beings are made to worship the divine in all things and to respond in gratitude for countless gifts. Thanksgiving is the wisdom of Shinto. One can encourage it, but most of all it is a gift in itself. Shinto tradition emphasizes first-hand experience of the world and of one's place in it.
But why not opt for mute adoration? Why choose to complicate matters by multiplying hopelessly inadequate attempts at capturing divinity?
Because that is an important part of being human. People need to talk about the sources of greatest wonderment, as well as about their hopes and fears and suffering. At the risk of being accused of idolatry, a charge non-Hindus often level at them. Hindus acknowledge a fundamental need for imagery. All religious traditions finally do something similar. Even the traditions that sound the loudest alarm about the dangers of idolatry. Judaism and Islam, for example, use extensive and vivid verbal imagery to say the ineffable. Most Hindus, like certain Christian and Buddhist communities, for example, include a wide array of visual expression side by side with the verbal. Words can become idols, too.
Do Muslims celebrate events in connection with any other religious figures?
Popular practice in many places still includes annual commemorations of birthdays and death anniversaries of various important holy persons and friends of God. Birthday celebrations of members of the Prophet's family, such as Sayyidah Zainab, remain popular in places like Egypt. Lasting for up to 7 days, the festivities are like sprawling street parties. Crowds grow daily, as does the intensity of the celebration. Vendors sell food and souvenirs and Quran reciters fill the air with sacred sounds from their booths up and down the streets. Mosques within the central area of celebration can be packed to overflowing. Birthdays of famous friends of God frequently include recitation of classic poems extolling the saints' spiritual achievements and glorious intimacy with God. Anniversaries of the death of God's special friends are also important in many regions, especially those further to the east, since holy persons are fully united with God at death. The occasions are sometimes referred to as the saint's wedding day, URS, pronounced OORS. On the 6th of Rajab, many Indian Muslims, and members of other faiths as well, observe the URS of Muin ad-Din Kishti, founder of a famous Sufi order, at his tomb in the city of Ajmer.
What distinguishes Reconstructionist Jews from others?
Reconstructionists have sought to reorient Jewish belief from its generally otherworldly focus to greater attentiveness to the here and now. Mordecai Kaplan, 1881–1983. Led the movement and taught that Jews must understand themselves as a civilization in process. Jewish life depended on so much more than unchanging religious practice. And he introduced dramatic changes into the religious understanding of Judaism. He chose to refer to the divinity rather than to God, seeking to purge the object of prayer of its anthropomorphic overtones. Thus God is more of a cosmic process than a personal creator and sustainer of all that is. Kaplan was most influential in expanding the function of the typical synagogue to include much more than regular liturgical worship. Reconstructionism is by far the smallest of the sub-communities of Judaism, with only about 100,000 in the United States. Since many Reform and conservative Jews have come to accept much of what Kaplan taught. In general, Reconstructionist congregations retain more traditional practices. such as wearing the prayer shawl, than do reformers.
Do Confucians believe in angels? What about devils?
Confucius and his disciples preferred not to speculate about the existence of the countless beings which in popular belief animated the spirit world. If there is good in the world, human beings can take some of the credit. When evil gets the upper hand, human beings must acknowledge their responsibility and set about re-establishing a just order. Confucian tradition does not explicitly deny that spirits, both satisfied and malevolent, regularly pass unseen and generally undetected through the lives of ordinary people. In fact, its insistence on the centrality of ancestor veneration is a clear, if implicit, acknowledgement of the spirit world. But apart from that, the tradition emphasizes the need for human beings to focus on the more immediate facts of life. Follow the example of the virtuous, strive to establish justice every day, and build all relationships on honesty. There will always be events human beings cannot explain simply, and circumstances beyond human control. Some of them may be attributable to spirits, but the important thing is not to become distracted from the ongoing demands of the call to personal virtue and responsibility.
What temple rites exists in Confucianism?
Confucian temples function principally as memorial halls. They are dedicated to the veneration and appreciation of the great sages, teachers and scholars of the tradition. Honoring the spirit and teaching of the great ones is not quite the same as praying to them in the way that some people pray to deities or to saints believed to have the power of intercession. Honoring the great Confucian figures generally lacks the kind of spontaneity one finds in the much busier Daoist and CCT temples. Confucian rituals tend to be more reserved and orderly and associated with specific occasions. Popular devotion, on the other hand, occurs virtually around the clock, 7 days a week.
How are Shinto leaders chosen and given authority?
Shinto priesthood has historically been a hereditary occupation. Even after the government officially took over the appointment of chief priests after 1868. Hereditary succession continued in many localities. Perhaps the most important ingredients in maintaining standards among Shinto officials are the 2 educational institutions now solely responsible for the training of priests. Tokyo's Kokyugakuen, National Learning University, is a relatively recent development. A private university that offers general education as well as the equivalent of Shinto seminary curriculum. It supplies research for the present centralized shrine authority, the Jinjia Hancho. The Kagakan, Imperial Hall of Learning, University near ISE was originally a public institution that closed after World War II and then reopened in 1952 as a private university. Priests to be study Japanese history and literature, but focus on Shinto studies, especially ritual and theology. Shinto priests are not ordained clergy, strictly speaking. They are laypersons granted certification or licensure upon satisfactory completion of the seminary curriculum and its qualifying exams.
What issues have characterized Shinto's relationships to other traditions?
Shinto has important connections primarily to Buddhism and Confucianism, and secondarily to the Christianity that missionaries brought to Japan in the early modern period. During much of medieval and early modern times, Shinto and Buddhist leaders and teachers worked together at articulating points of theological cooperation between various schools of thought in the two traditions. That ongoing interaction resulted in the various types of Ryobyu, or two-sided, Shinto as well as other syncretistic denominations and sects. Such cooperation continued until the 13th and 14th centuries, when some Shinto thinkers developed belief systems in which Shinto stood at the top of a theological mountain. By the 17th century, the national learning movement began to offer a fully articulated interpretation of Buddhist-Shinto relations. Scholars suggested that the major figures of the Buddhist pantheon were nothing more than local forms of the kami, and that the emperor descended directly from the sun goddess, Amaterasu. Confucianism had by that time made its presence felt more vigorously than ever through its impact on courtly life and administration of the Tokugawa shogunate, 1600 to 1867. Confucian scholars and bureaucrats also contributed significantly to the Meiji Restoration in 1868, but the more closely Shinto theology came to be identified with the Japanese throne, the more it developed into a national ideology with little room for systems of belief considered. Non-Japanese Buddhism and Confucianism, first and foremost, but now missionary Christianity as well. Contemporary Shinto has once again become more open to interaction with other traditions, and Shinto leaders take it for granted that many who worship at shrines also maintain other religious affiliations. For many Japanese, the Kami way is not a separate system of religious beliefs. It is simply what all religious persons believe underneath all their otherwise distinctive doctrines. Shinto is therefore nothing less than the very essence of acknowledging the divine in the world.
How and where do members of local Muslim communities come together?
When small local communities of Muslims begin to form in new locations, they typically begin by meeting in each other's homes for social and religious purposes. As their numbers grow, they need to look for a space large enough to accommodate them. In many American cities, for example, Muslims have acquired everything from former storefront buildings to former Christian churches. There they will remain until further growth and financial success permit more ambitious options, such as acquiring a piece of property, having it zoned properly, and building a dedicated facility. Whatever the venue in which they gather for prayer. Muslims call that place a masjid, a place of prostration. The word mosque is rooted in the medieval Spanish pronunciation of masjid. Technically, one needs no specific place for the prostration of ritual prayer. Every place is a mosque, so long as one hallows the space and orients it toward Mecca. But community growth and the requirement of coming together on Fridays for a congregational prayer have made the institution known as the mosque a common sight all over the world, and increasingly in the United States as well. There are now more than 1,000 mosques across the country. Most mosque communities eventually develop a full complement of governing, advisory, and functional committees, with emphasis on a fairly egalitarian form of governance.
Is ritual sacrifice part of Shinto tradition?
According to Shinto tradition, the kami neither require nor ask for sacrificial offerings. Sacrifices in many traditions imply the need to assuage guilt or undo an evil action. Shinto tradition focuses on impurities that one can overcome merely by sincere purification. Some rituals in Shinto history have included animal sacrifice, perhaps under the influence of imported Chinese practices. But that did not become a regular feature of Shinto worship.
Do Hindu communities run private schools for their children?
Among more traditional upper caste Hindus, gurus still provide a special education for boys. But the practice seems to be slowly disappearing. Most active Hindu devotees tend to think of religious education as a matter of family tradition. As a result, apart from the ancient guru affiliation, Hindus generally have not developed school systems analogous to those that some Jews, Christians, and Muslims have established in order to hand on their traditions. Some organizations, such as the Vedanta Society and smaller communities of devotees, offer courses of education generally for older members.
What were the laws of Richard I to crusaders traveling by sea, 1189 CE?
At the time of the Crusades, Richard I issued the following laws to his soldiers traveling by sea. Richard, by the grace of God, King of England, and Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, and Count of Anjou, to all his subjects who are about to go by sea to Jerusalem, greeting. Know that we, by the common counsel of upright men, have made the laws here given. whoever slays a man on shipboard shall be bound to the dead man and thrown into the sea. But if he shall slay him on land, he shall be bound to the dead man and buried in the earth. If anyone, moreover, shall be convicted through lawful witnesses of having drawn a knife to strike another, or of having struck him so as to draw blood, he shall lose his hand. But if he shall strike him with his fist without drawing blood, he shall be dipped 3 times in the sea. But if anyone shall taunt or insult a comrade or charge him with hatred of God, as many times as he shall have insulted him, so many ounces of silver shall he pay. A robber, moreover, convicted of theft, shall be shorn like a hired fighter, and boiling tar shall be poured over his head, and feathers from a cushion shall be shaken out over his head, so that he may be publicly known. And at the first land where the ships put in he shall be cast on shore, under my own witness at Shinan.
When religion becomes a crime.
The Russian Revolution of 1917 launched a wave of tremendous change in Russia, affecting all aspects and strata of society. When Vladimir Lenin, the principal leader of the revolution, died in 1924, a struggle ensued for control of the party and, by extension, the country. Joseph Stalin emerged as the country's new dictator. By 1929, when longtime rival Leon Trotsky was exiled, Stalin was firmly in power. A ruthless dictator, he quickly set a course of isolationism and nationalism. Policies that would effectively cut the USSR off from much of the rest of Western civilization. Stalin presided over a basic reorientation of Russian culture and society during the 1930s. He instituted severe policies in the realms of art, education, religion, and family life that had a tremendous impact on all Soviet citizens, from the poorest peasant to Moscow's leading intellectuals. This process came to be known as Stalinization. In 1929 laws were passed under which the practice and spread of religion became a crime against the state. Churches were destroyed, priests were stripped of their civil rights, and their children were forced to renounce their fathers or risk death. 3 years later, a program for the total eradication of religion from the Soviet Union was announced. The very notion of God will be expunged as a survival of the Middle Ages and an instrument for holding down the working masses, the official announcement proclaimed. The Communist Party and the Soviet state subsequently established themselves in the place formerly occupied by religion. The study of history, science, the arts, and other subjects also underwent significant change in the 1930s. As the government introduced new conservative standards designed to focus education efforts on increasing worker skills and productivity. Finally, Stalin insisted on a return to traditional family values. Homosexual behavior and abortion were criminalized, divorces were made much more difficult to obtain, and the Marxist-inspired drive for women's emancipation fell into disrepair. To ensure that the masses heeded this new emphasis, it was understood that the state had an obligation to scrutinize all members of Russian society. Thousands were found wanting and were punished severely.
How do Jews celebrate birth?
When God made a covenant with Abraham, Genesis 17. The removal of the foreskin of the penis was to be the sign of its ratification. Circumcision of baby boys generally occurs on the 8th day, performed by a specialist called a mohel, who is often a rabbi, in the baby's home. After the surgical procedure and accompanying prayers are completed, participants bless a cup of wine. Parents then declare the child's name. Reform communities now have a parallel home ritual to welcome baby girls, including all but the surgery. Other congregations still generally perform the naming ritual for girls in the synagogue. Some still give children two names, one religious, in Hebrew or Yiddish, and one secular. In addition to these early rituals, a ritual of redemption of a firstborn son also occurs on the 31st day of his life. The practice arose from the biblical teaching that each firstborn son belongs to God but can be bought back, Numbers 18:15-16. In general, the ritual is tied to the residual importance of the hereditary priesthood. For it requires a Cohen, or descendant of the biblical priesthood, to perform it.
How big is the Quran and how is it organized?
The sacred scripture contains about 6,000 verses, roughly equivalent in length to the New Testament. Arranged in 114 sections called surahs, pronounced surah. Muhammad's earliest revelations tend to be short, rhetorically potent utterances in an ancient form of rhymed prose used by pre-Islamic seers and soothsayers. Later surahs tend to be lengthier and more prosaic, and often take up more practical concerns. Surahs are arranged in more or less descending order of length, so that many of the earlier sections are actually in the latter part of the book now. The heading of each surah contains the title, number of verses, and an indication as to whether it was revealed at Mecca or Medina. Interpreters consider it very important to place each text historically, for the circumstances of the revelation are critical in unwrapping its original meaning. Tradition has identified the surahs, or portions of them where it is clear that a single surah is actually a composite, as early, middle, or late Meccan, 610 to 622, or Medinan, 622 to 632. Muslims believe the Quran is the direct, literal word of God, unmodified in any way by the Prophet who uttered them at God's bidding.
How did the teachings of Confucius spread?
Very soon after his death, the followers of Confucius initiated what would become a centuries-long process of elevating their teacher above the ranks of ordinary people. They revered him as a special ancestral figure, the pinnacle of wisdom. They built a temple in his honor in Khufu in 478 BCE and, not long after that, began to enshrine statues and paintings of the teacher and his major disciples there. Official imperial exaltation of Confucius did not begin until nearly 5 centuries after his death. After Han Emperor Ping proclaimed Confucius the exalted Mt. Ni Duke of highest perfection in the year 1 CE, a dozen other sovereigns followed, bestowing similar accolades down to at least the 16th century. In keeping with the hierarchy of royal titles, the emperors decreed that Confucius would be known by such titles as Duke, First Teacher, First Sage, High King of Learning, and Ultimate Sage. Around 1530 CE, emperors stopped using the language of royalty and switched to a set of titles designed to reflect wisdom rather than temporal power. As early as the mid-5th century CE, the imperial authority dedicated a temple to Confucius, and within a century or two decreed state-sponsored offerings in the master's honor. Though Confucians have never considered Confucius divine, he has clearly ranked at the very zenith of human perfection.
What do Jews believe about God?
God is both utterly transcendent and strikingly accessible, both awe-commanding and irresistible. As the ultimate majestic power, the merest hint of divine nearness brings all creation to its knees. This God is the Holy One of Israel, into whose presence only a fool would enter nonchalantly. Any person of sense knows instinctively that to approach God is to be filled with dread. That's what holy means: forbidden, off limits. Holy other. Dread is not always a bad thing. Here it is clearly an appropriate response. This does not mean that God is cruel or despotic. Although some scriptural accounts might seem to convey that impression. Recall the story of the men assigned to carry the Ark of the Covenant to its new abode. When their ox stumbled, one man lunged for the ark to keep it from slipping from the cart and was instantly struck dead. The point of the story is that God means danger. And when God claims allegiance, there is no room for the tentative. Abraham was ready to sacrifice his son Isaac. Israel's kings and military commanders were ordered to commit total war, sparing nothing, so jealous was God for complete dedication. At the same time, Jewish images of God convey a divine intimacy and immediacy. God creates all things by the unimaginable power of divine speech. Every divine word is immediately embodied in some undeniable event. God walks with Adam in the cool of the evening and delivers through the prophets a message of absolute tenderness. Most of all, the God of the Hebrew Bible is unfailingly devoted to his people. This God acts in all the events of human history.
What's the difference between prophetic and apocalyptic literature?
It is not always possible to apply the distinction neatly to important texts in the Hebrew Bible. But it is useful to keep the following important differences in mind. First, prophets and apocalypticists have different missions. Prophets tend to be action-oriented, passing critical judgment on individual events as they unfold in the political and religious development of Israel, which is under both divine and Davidic sovereignty. Apocalyptic works are products of people dedicated to the written word as a vehicle for passing judgment on the whole of history, not just that of Israel and its monarchy. Second, the content of the biblical works they have produced differs markedly. Prophets describe specific examples of injustice seen in the context of an ethical struggle within Israel, which God's judgment over his people will resolve on the coming day of the Lord. Writers of apocalyptic works offer more generalized and highly symbolic visions of the reign of evil. Visions that only a divinely commissioned angel can interpret. God's judgment will be manifest in a final cosmic cataclysm, a final battle, sometimes called Armageddon, between the forces of good and evil. Finally, prophetic texts generally claim authorship by name while apocalyptic texts typically use a pseudonym, either to add credibility to their visions of the future or to avoid retaliation from the authorities of their own day.
Are there any signs or symbols that might identify an individual as a Buddhist?
In most parts of the world in which Buddhism remains an important presence, it is a safe bet that many people on the street have had some direct contact with Buddhist tradition. But it is usually difficult to tell Buddhists from non-Buddhists merely by looking at their clothing or other personal effects. Occasionally you will spot an item of jewelry whose symbolism is more or less explicitly Buddhist. The eight-spoked wheel of Dharma is a common symbol easily reproduced on small-scale items. Buddhist pilgrims, however, often stand out because of the traditional garb and variety of symbols they wear. In Japan, for example, some pilgrims wear a large, round, pointed, or bowl-like straw hat, carry pilgrim staffs, and wear around their necks a small cloth wallet, in which to collect the souvenir stamps they receive from each temple they visit. Monks, nuns, and priests are surely the most obvious examples here of distinctive signs. Nearly everywhere in the world, monks and nuns shave their heads. They typically wear a distinctive habit or garb, consisting of 2 or 3 wraps, 2 for novices, 3 for senior monks and nuns. One wrap covers the lower body, another the upper. For religious rituals, monks wear a long cloth of 12 folds, sometimes called the stole, over the left shoulder. Colors vary according to region and institutional affiliation. from one branch of the monastic order or Buddhist lineage to another. Saffron is the most common color for monastic garb, but, for example, Tibetan monks often wear a dark burgundy, Japanese monks typically don darker shades of gray, brown, and violet, and Chinese nuns often wear a simple gray robe.
Do Jews use special symbolism in personal, private, or non-liturgical rituals?
In addition to the ritual articles mentioned earlier, Jews use a number of important symbols while praying at home or for occasions such as weddings. During the observance of Passover, the kiddush, or blessing, cup is an important item. Some ritual sets designed for the Seder, order, ritual for Passover ceremony include a special Elijah cup set aside for the special guest, the prophet who may appear at any time. Some families are fortunate enough to own heirloom silver cups. Similar goblets are used in wedding ceremonies and in the ceremony that marks the separation. Havdalah, of Holy Sabbath time from the rest of the week. The Havdalah occurs Saturday evening at sundown to mark the end of the 24-hour period begun Friday at sundown. Jewish tradition measures all days this way. Also used in the latter is a small symbol called the spice tower that recalls a reference in Song of Songs to the safekeeping of precious spices. Traditional Jewish communities have produced magnificent illuminated pages called ketubah to recognize marriage vows. Typical decorations there include allusions to the temple and its implements in addition to scenes of domestic life. Amulets worn around the neck or suspended over an infant's cradle have been popular throughout Jewish history. Many are made of silver. A more elaborate and expensive amulet might include the tablets of the law along with a number of symbols of the temple, such as the menorah, incense burner, and ritual headdress of the high priest. A stylized hand in outline, used as a pendant or on a keychain, symbolizes divine protection and functions as an amulet.
What signs or symbols distinguish Hindu religious specialists?
Priests in most Hindu temples, whatever the denomination, generally wear a simple body wrap that covers one or both shoulders. Sometimes they will remove the upper wrap altogether. Priests may wear a white thread across the left shoulder, a symbol of initiation into the sacred scriptures. Some priests wear a set of beads, called a mala, or rosary, used to count in the repetition of sacred words or syllables. Around the neck or wrist. Members of various monastic orders often wear a saffron or salmon-colored robe that is the habit or distinctive garb of the organization. Shaivite sadhus sometimes carry the trident, a symbol sacred to Shiva.
What does serpent handling have to do with Christianity?
Several small, mostly rural, churches in the United States have focused their worship life around the unusual and dangerous practice of handling poisonous snakes. They take their cue from Mark 16:18, according to which a sign of those who believe in Jesus is that they will take up serpents. Worship gatherings in these churches involve intensely emotional prayer and increasingly agitated music and dancing. People toward the front of the church who feel so moved will remove a poisonous snake, or even two, from their containers, holding them up at face level while dancing around the room. Some say it is the music and motion that prevent the serpents from striking. Rattlesnakes seem to be the serpent of choice, perhaps because the noise they make with their tails adds to the drama and because the rattling might warn of an imminent strike. Copperheads and water moccasins are also sometimes used. Many worshippers have been bitten, some many times, and more than a few have died. But that in no way deters worshippers from continuing the practice. Ever in search of perfect faith and trust in God.
Is exorcism important in Shinto practice?
Demons and assorted evil influences miss no opportunity to make nuisances of themselves. Especially at times when human beings and natural processes are most vulnerable. Beginnings, such as planting time or the birth of an infant, can be particularly difficult in this respect. Shinto tradition includes various understandings of how evil forces work and several methods for contending with them. Most undesirable forces are associated with impurity and pollution. Some evil spirits will depart in a ritual that designates as a scapegoat any animal or object capable of taking on the negative forces. Emperors of old rubbed a human effigy over their bodies, leaving all personal impurity on the image, which officials of the Bureau of Yin and Yang then ritually consigned to a river. Other rituals use a weapon such as a sword to attack the evil power as though it were a physical presence. Some rituals assume the evil forces have taken on demonic bodies and must be pursued and expelled from a locality. In one rite, people throw soybeans in unlucky directions and command the demons to depart. An important part of the spring Setsubun, season change. Matsuri. Some large festivals are entirely dedicated to a type of communal exorcism. An originally Buddhist rite called Goryeo-e, meeting with august spirits, has been associated with Kyoto's famous Jun Matsuri, for example. That festival arose out of a need to banish the spirits of disease, and eventually grew into a full-scale Shinto celebration. Another important interpretation of spirit possession has been traditionally associated with the belief that the fox is capable of changing shapes. Extraordinary spiritual states were therefore sometimes explained as a type of fox possession. Some popular traditions identify various psychosomatic illnesses as forms of possession. Soul pacification, tamashizume, is a kind of reverse exorcism in which ritualists seek to make a spirit content to remain in the body of a person suffering from illness.
Is ritual sacrifice part of Shinto tradition?
According to Shinto tradition, the kami neither require nor ask for sacrificial offerings. Sacrifices in many traditions imply the need to assuage guilt or undo an evil action. Shinto tradition focuses on impurities that one can overcome merely by sincere purification. Some rituals in Shinto history have included animal sacrifice. Perhaps under the influence of imported Chinese practices. But that did not become a regular feature of Shinto worship.
Are there any Shinto divination rituals?
Bokusen is the Japanese term for the complex process of divining auspicious times for agriculturalists. Divination encompasses a variety of specific devices. As in Chinese community traditions, people often draw lots, the Chinese shake bundles of numbered sticks and pull the one left protruding, and Shinto worshippers draw numbered bits of paper. Sometimes they will read the angle at which an arrow sticks in its target, or read the designs on a turtle shell, or hold a deer's shoulder blade in a flame and observe how it cracks. A similar ritual uses arrows for slightly different purposes. People purchase white arrows at shrine shops, especially around the New Year, and use them as amulets, protective devices, at home throughout the year. Divination is required for setting the dates for many major festivals. Ritual leaders invite certain divinatory kami to be in attendance. As the diviner kindles a sacred fire on which to heat a turtle shell. Specialists then read the relationship of the cracks to lines and characters pre-drawn on the shell. A ritual cousin of Chinese Feng Shui is called Kaso. It involves a set of geomantic calculations to establish optimal conditions for all sorts of human habitations. Another type of divination has worshippers write on small pieces of paper their various options as they prepare to make a major decision. In what may be a variation on a contemporary popular Chinese practice, people typically pull a stick from a bundle, read its number, and take a piece of pre-written advice from a correspondingly numbered drawer. Numerous Shinto shrines provide racks where people who find the advice unpalatable can tie their paper to be rid of the effects of the bad news.